Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a new ForoCompetencia breakfast. We have a privilege today of having Professor Aurelien Portuese with us. He's a research professor and founding director of the George Washington University's Competition and Innovation Lab. And he recently published a very interesting book, which I have here, on the battle for the future of antitrust. So I asked him if we could present what his thesis and this book, which is definitely very timely and put some clarity on a very complex context. Without further introduction, Aurelien, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Julian. Thank you, everybody, for having me, and I'm looking forward to discussing this newly published book. So I'm Aurelien Portuese. I'm professor at George Washington University. I'm the founding director of the GW Competition Innovation Lab. We're a global center who focus on competition and innovation and from a global perspective, like with many regional initiatives all over the world. And actually, that's a very important point that I want to make from the start. Our lab is focused on competition and innovation, and these very interactions and how those two interact with one another. This is a complex relationship, and that is also seen in the past, present, and the future of antitrust. This complex how we do the interplay between those two is at the core of this book, and is the core of what every antitrust lawyers and economists should think of. And just to see how timely those discussions are. At the lab, we have Professor Philippe Aguillon, who has been just awarded the Nobel Prize laureate about this precisely this relationship between competition and innovation, and how competition can foster innovation, and how innovation can foster competition, and what's the optimal level of competition we need as opposed to the level of innovation that we need. So those critical question about how to think about the role of antitrust in optimizing competition innovation is very critical. Also, this book is very timely because we're in the midst of a political changes, not only, of course, in the US with the new Trump administration, which revised what we have done when it comes to antitrust, but also in Europe when even like as we speak, the European Commission is revising its merger guidelines and the way they should review mergers. So this is just to tell you that we are at the crossroad, and I wanted to write this book because the question is, how can the past of antitrust can shed light to the future of antitrust and where we go from there? And one part of the answer is like we can answer from a technical and specific case specific perspective, but we can also answer from a conceptual philosophical perspective. And that's exactly the approach of this book. How can we conceptualize? How can we look at different concepts throughout history and try to anticipate the future? And what I see is three main school of thought that have been very important in the history of antitrust, and that especially in the US, but also because of the role of the US internationally, it has been important when it comes to antitrust globally. The first thing is one. I mean, if we want to understand perhaps the simple way to put antitrust in terms of intellectual tensions, there's two main paradigms that we want to think when we think about antitrust. One is looking at antitrust as decentralization. Antitrust should be here to decentralize from a deontological perspective, not putting economics first, but from a legal, ethical perspective, we want to decentralize the economy in order to get rid of those monopolies and the dependencies that business users and consumers may have. So there's this strong, I would say, originalist perspective of antitrust that were at the beginning of the antitrust laws in the late 19th century in the US. And the other one is more from a technical perspective. Okay, antitrust may lead to decentralization of the economy, but we want to foster competition and we want to foster innovation, and we want antitrust as a tool to increase efficiency. And these tensions between antitrust as a decentralization tool and antitrust as an efficiency tool, I think is at the heart of these different school of thoughts that come clash and also enrich one another, and where we have also some synthesis. Think of like the populist, the Chicago school, and then we have some sort of like post-Chicago school, which is a synthesis where we take the both of different schools. So I think I looked at that, and it's just like it looks like a pendulum swing of intellectual influence on antitrust. How can we move from one school to another? Well, because those two polar opposites is one looking at antitrust as a decentralization tool, one looking at antitrust as a technocratic efficiency instruments. And in between, you have all this spectrum of schools from Chicago, post-Chicago, mainstream or main left, center right, Austrian economics, Schumpeterian approach. And the question is, why isn't that clear? Why we haven't settled the kind of intellectual approach to antitrust, and where do we go from there? And so that is the main thrust of the argument of this book, to look at what we've been through. The main thing over the last, I would say, 10 years, as everybody has noticed, is the claim that the Chicago school has failed, right? We heard that not only during the Biden administrations, where this has been like 40 years of failure. And so the whole paradigm that perhaps a lot of us have been educating in, which was the Chicago school type of things, or the economic analysis of law, and specifically the economic analysis of antitrust, has been completely shattered over the last couple of years or 5 years, and of course with ripple effect from the US to Europe and in other parts of the world. So one thing is to see that what I call Borkian antitrust, because there's always like some thought leaders in each school. Of course, it's a group, it's a collective, but there's always like one perhaps figurehead of a specific school of thought, right? So I take three figureheads of these three school of thoughts that fundamentally influenced antitrust. One is, of course, Robert Bork with the Chicago School. He was not the only one, of course, and he never referred to a Chicago school. He never taught at the University of Chicago himself, but still is a very strong representative of the Chicago School. The second is, of course, Justice Brandeis, who himself may disagree with the new Brandeisians, but at least the same philosophy where the new Brandeisians have taken on the work of Justice Brandeis in the beginning of the century. And finally, someone who's never talked about antitrust, but who has a real effect on antitrust thinking, is Schumpeter, Joseph Schumpeter, when it comes to thinking about competition and innovation. And so I look at those three schools of thought, and I start with the Borkian, what I call Borkian antitrust, this idea of a very reductionist or minimalist approach to antitrust and putting limits on antitrust. What can antitrust do? What can it do? What it shouldn't do? And just trying to see where antitrust is failing and generating more unintended consequence and costs than benefits. That's the Chicago School, where they really came with this consumer welfare standard that really dominated not only in the US, but all over the world. And perhaps Europeans will not recognize that, but still it's very influential standard, even in European competition law and in other parts of the world, even if it may not be the only criterion, of course, because in Europe you have other objectives, such as the market integration objective. But still, the consumer welfare standard was a fantastic and phenomenal victory of the Chicago School. And I think we were confident, almost confident, that was it. It was almost the end of history. I think there was some couple of articles about that, like the end of history of antitrust. That's it. We moved away from the populist to the Chicago School, and that's it. Well, because even the post-Chicago School was some refinement, taking some reversed presumptions and creating some presumptions in the potential anti-competitive behaviors, but it was very still technical, economic driven, and highly expert-led kind of antitrust. And so that's it. People really thought that it was over. But guess what? We are we've been in the midst of change. And why? Why Borkian antitrust or the Chicago was under assault, especially in the US? Well, I think the answer is pretty clear for many reasons, and history again gives us teachings. In each time every time we have a massive innovation, we have a massive surge of populism because the innovation creates few winners and a lot of people who may be losers, disrupted and losing their jobs, and by this undercut competition that Schumpeter has described, and that can really destroy and make businesses bankrupt. So because we had this massive industrial revolution in the late 19th century, railroads, electricity, we had this populist surge of antitrust. And because we have this massive digital fourth industrial digital revolutions in the early 2000s, early 2010s, with the massive rise of super dominant, super large technological firms who've disrupted whole industries from newspapers, hotels, taxi drivers. Just think of the number of industries that they've disrupted just for the benefit of one platform in that industry with massive margins because of it's all digitalized, right? It's not physical, and few winners and many losers. I mean, the example of taxi drivers is a good example. Like, well, think of Uber coming and disrupting the taxi. Well, how many unhappy taxi drivers you make, and how many winners you make? Well, you made one winner, which is the at least the Uber platform, and many unhappy people who can be unionized and can coalesce in protest. These are the taxi drivers. And so this massive digital innovation inevitably created a new form of populism. And when I say populism, it's not in a derogatory way. It's because the populists claim themselves to be populist, right? I mean, that's why I reference in the book. Perhaps the populism has a different connotations in other parts of the world, but at least in the US, there's a pride of being populist. Like, and when I say populist, again, it's not left wing or right wing. It's against something that is against the mainstream. So what is populism? Well, populism is precisely a thin layered ideology. So it's not something like socialism or communism where there's a strong ideology where you can conceptualize things. It's thin layers. It's like very malleable and adjustable. It's mostly relying on demagoguery and the charisma of a leader. And we see that. I mean, in the left, it could have been perhaps the Linacan of the world. In the right, it's perhaps the Donald Trump, who are the incarnation of populism, and that leads to speak to the main of speak to the voice of the people against the mainstream. Who are the elites? Well, those coastal elites in the U.S. from New York to Miami or Seattle to San Francisco, those mainstream. And when the Rust Belt, the Midwest of the US has been so disrupted where they lost all their jobs. And actually that's how antitrust started. If you look at antitrust, it started with the Kansas state antitrust law that was passed in Kansas in the Rust Belt in order to fight against the coastal elite. And then there was a federalization of antitrust at the federal level with the Sherman Act. So we see all these same effect. So why Bork and antitrust was so criticized? Well, it's not about Bork and the consumer welfare standard itself. It's the effect of globalizations, the centralizations of corporations in the hands of few largely profitable digital company, while all these jobs being lost. So it was almost like the consumer welfare standard was almost like a scapegoat in order to reach political and economic ends of redistribution, in order to really tame the centralization of monopolies. So That's what I've tried to explain in the book. The Bork and antitrust was just inevitably about to fade because of the rise of digital innovation and the rise of populism that could not accept the massive centralization of jobs, wealth in those coastal regions in the hands of the few, as opposed to the large redistributive aspect of antitrust. And that's where we come back to the other hands, which is antitrust as decentralization. That's why the shift has been so dramatic. It's not like a change in the technical aspect from a Chicago school to a post-Chicago school where we can discuss the fine details of it. It's because antitrust was focused, as I said in the beginning, on efficiency, and the only alternative is antitrust as decentralization. And that's where we saw Brandeisian, what I call Brandeisian antitrust, in the rise. And that's why ironically, the Brandeisians are the most originalist. That's why they refer so much to the Schuman Act and coming back to the originalist vision of the Schuman Act or the FTC Act or the Clinton Act. They want to undo 50 years of Chicago school in order to come back to the populist origins of Brandeisms of decentralizations. Irrespectively of the economics analysis, irrespectively of the economic cost, we should do decentralization for the sake of it. It's a deontological imperative, like you could call it like a Kantian categorical imperatives, as opposed to a consequentialist ethics from the Chicago school. And so that is very interesting because it's not, it's reviving the anti-monopoly, pro-decentralization essence of antitrust. And there's no good argument against it because people can use the law in order to reach deontological, ethical objectives, right? You can say use the law irrespective of economic cost. That's what is good for society. I believe that's what is the good outcome for society. So I should use the law in order to reach that objective. And the economic analysis of law that tainted antitrust for the last 50 years is not a good answer. It's not a rational, good answer for those folks who may just want to reach that outcome, right? And so that's why we had those two schools who were not speaking at each other. That's why there's been so much heat in the debate, as we've seen over the last 5, 10 years, not only in the US, but all over the years, because they don't speak the same language. They don't speak the same language. One is talking about economics and efficiency. The other one is talking about the law and the deontological imperatives. And so there is a complete divorce between the two. And I think the radicality of the Brandeisians, sometimes I think they've misconstrued Brandeis himself, because if you read Brandeis, Brandeis was very much against big corporations and wanted a kind of decentralized economy, but he was equally against big governments. And that's something that perhaps the Brandeisians have forgotten, right? When it comes to the FTC rulemaking, how much expansion of the regulatory administrative state they wanted, I think it was very expensive. Something that Justice Brandeis always really was skeptical of. He was anti-bigness, both bigness of corporations and bigness of governments. That's why he believed in states as the laboratory of democracy, because he was very skeptical of the federal power and any governmental entity in general. So he wanted a regulated capitalism. He never wanted some sort of socialistic experiment. That was very clear in the election of the 1912, where he contributed to defeat a socialist candidate. And so I think the Brandeisians took the anti-monopoly tradition of Brandeis, but they didn't take the whole complexity of the thought of Brandeis himself. But never, be that as it may, I think it's important to understand that Brandeisian antitrust was under the spotlight because it was a hope for many business users, for many consumers to regain control of these globalized, large scale firms that disrupted their way of life. Think of you're employed in a small grocery in Midwest, and these groceries are acquired by Amazon, which itself is located at headquartered in Seattle. So the headquarters are far away from home. The decision-making process is far away from home. You lose your job where you are, and so all the disruptions was extremely upsetting for a lot of people. You're a journalist, you lost your job for some other content aggregator, and your newspaper cannot hire and it just went to bankruptcy because they don't control the value creation anymore. Is those content aggregators that creates a lot of resentment, and so these Brandeisians were the answer to that political discontent. But yet, because they were too radical in avoiding the positive economic benefits of of their behavior, like prohibiting mergers almost no matter what. Well, I think not all mergers are bad, and a lot of mergers, most of the time, are positive. Positive not only for the acquiring company, but for the startups that is being acquired. And so that's why this kind of revolution was pretty short-lived. But I want to emphasize that Brandeisians is not necessarily something that is associated with the far left, because we have a lot of in the far right as well. Like that's what perhaps Friedrich Hayek has described very well half a century ago, when the extremes come together to coalesce, and the hemicycle is not a hemicycle, it's a full circle, right? So the idea that there is the populist vision of antitrust is not left or right. It's a discontent against the mainstream technical analysis and the globalized affairs that leads to a monopolized economy. And so this movement that started around the 2010, 2014 in the US and really took ascent even during the first Trump administration. And let's be honest, it's not Biden administration that created the antitrust populism. It was already there with the Trump administration. If you look at it, the last week of the Trump administration, that's when the Trump administration sued Google and Meta. So the two main cases that we talk about for the last many years, Google and Meta, the US versus Google and Meta, were started by the Trump administration in the last week of its presidency in 2020. So in 2019. And then, of course, the Biden administration's rebranded that, or like used that as a way for a conceptual philosophical change where they apply. But the radicality of the changes, also the rulemaking aspect where they believed expansion of regulatory governmental power, the FTC, what the FTC can do, what the FTC, I think was not really Brandeisian itself, but also it created a lot of skepticism, saying like, hey, perhaps it's an overreach. The judge were not all in. They haven't approved. So that's why I call it Brandeisian antitrust under the spotlight, because we had this starification or star-like phenomenon of these new Brandeisians, where most of them were young, most of them were very brilliant, very clever and smart, very articulate, and the rise was sudden, but the fall was also almost sudden. It's not completely fallen, it's not completely gone. Of course, we live in a post-Brandeisian world where there is a lot of to be left. I mean, just one example is the merger guidelines in the US, which have been approved by the new Trump administration. So what the Brandeisians have done is not gone. There's a lot of contributions that will, but the whole essence of treating big is bad, or this anti-monopoly tradition, I think is much reduced. And then the question is, well, what's left? What's left for antitrust? Because we've done populism, right, in the late 19th century, the beginning of the antitrust era. Then we had this Borkian antitrust with the Chicago School around the 50s and 60s. And then we have these new Brandeisians in the 2000s, 2010s, I would say. So what's left? Well, here and there, if you look at the history of antitrust, we had this kind of Schumpeterian antitrust. And that is very interesting because Schumpeterian antitrust it's not something like a school of thought. Actually, it's a real criticism and reconceptualization of antitrust. First, let's go back to Borkian antitrust. First, Bork and other in the Chicago School made many assumptions, many claims that are, without being Brandeisians, without being populist, are contestable and we can doubt, right? Fact that Congress wrote the Sherman Act, that's what it is, wrote the Sherman Act, meaning that they wanted the consumer welfare standards, we know it's not true. And yet it's one of the main premises of the Chicago School. Like when the Congress drafted the Sherman Act, they meant efficiency, they meant consumer welfare standards. We know it's not true. So Bork and antitrust was ripe for a lot of criticism. The idea that we should only focus on consumer welfare standards, of course, a lot of Chicago school people will say like, oh, it's not only the consumer, it will be the total welfare standard. Yes, but still, we're very bad at accounting for innovation in other aspects than pure consumer prices in Chicago School. I understand that it's much broader than consumer prices, but still, the focus is predominantly about consumer prices. When we live in a world where we have zero price markets, digital companies charge zero price because it's all ad driven product and services. And we have an innovation race where digital companies don't care about the price they charge. They just innovate, they burn cash for 10 years, hoping to recoup in the next 20 years with some product that they can't even price because those products haven't been invented yet. So I think the analytical framework for Bork and antitrust is not very ripe for the digital economy. And also the conceptual claims or made by Bork and like, oh, it has always been about consumer welfare and Congress always wanted consumer welfare, I think are not very strong and they could be highly criticized. So the question is, we cannot come back to the Borkian antitrust because too much harm or too much damage has been done to this school of thought, right? Like all this discussion in Congress for new bills, for new ex ante regulations, all these 40 years of failure, as President Biden has explained. This is very well accepted, even if you agree or not, but at least it's very like, okay, we cannot just do business as usual and go back to what we used to do like in the 70s, right? Like, okay, Brandeisian antitrust has failed. Oh, you know what? That's great. Let's go back to. And my point is proven by precisely the new Trump administration. Lina Khan is gone. The Brandeisians are gone. Let's still confirm, approve the merger guidelines. Let's still continue those cases. So it's like moving past Brandeisian antitrust without going back to the Chicago School. So where are we? What are we doing? Well, that's a big question. That's the $1 million question, actually. And so I think it's not easy. And I try to predict the future. I try to anticipate what could become just looking at the past. And one school of thought that's been perhaps overlooked, again, is the Schumpeterian antitrust, in a sense that going back to my first point between the relationship between competition and innovation, it's not the idea is that companies not necessarily out-compete rivals in order to win the competition. Like by out-competing, I mean like being better price or like trying to like a neck and neck competition, like two competitors in with homogeneous product trying to compete and with better marketing, better price, more aggressive strategy, whatever. The idea is not so much to out-compete rivals in order to win, but it's to out-innovate rivals to completely win the market. You don't win the market by marginally increasing market shares. You win the market by destroying those market shares with a complete new innovation. That's what Schumpeter would call the bombardment. We're not here to the bomb. You just like you have a new rivals that completely destroy the incumbents. And so the idea is like, well, actually, do we want competition because it fosters innovation? Or shouldn't we be focusing on maximizing innovation because that's how we foster competition? We should perhaps make sure that we can do whatever we can, and we have in our toolkits to increase innovation because increasing innovation will be the only way for those potential entrants to disrupt incumbents. And that's what has been said, I mean, since the 40s by Schumpeter and others. But of course, this heterodox economics has been not mainstream, as you can guess. Because first, it disrupts Borkian antitrust, but even somehow Brandeisian antitrust, is to say that, well, the main metrics we should assess antitrust competition and look at things is not so much quantitative metrics, is qualitative metrics. It's not computing market shares and price and specific size of firms and thresholds and what is qualitative metrics, innovation, capabilities, and other aspects that could potentially show a competitive constraints on incumbents or the lack of competitive constraints. And the second thing is, of course, an assumption that the best disciplining factor to those large large monopolies, whatever tech or non-tech, would be market forces. And that is something that obviously regulators and others are very uncomfortable with. But unfortunately, we've seen that a lot. Like the main way to disrupt the NTNT was not with some regulation; it was with internet. The main way to disrupt the Microsoft monopoly in the 2000s, it was not with like unbundling Internet Explorer and Windows. It was with the new search engine and Google and Chrome and whatever. So the new way of disrupting the smartphone economy was not having better Nokia, Ericsson, and BlueBerry competing. It was with an Apple iPhone. And so it's where the competition doesn't come neck and neck, but come from a diagonal, right? From another industry that enter that industry and completely disrupt this industry. And that's where the innovation forces are the greatest, and that's where the competition is at the greatest. And that's where Schumpeterian antitrust have something to say. So this dynamic approach, I'm an editor of the Antitrust Law Journal at the ABA as well, and we just published a whole symposium, 2 volumes on dynamic competition. Because the idea behind Schumpeterian antitrust is to foster dynamic competition, where we look at competition between as under Chicago School or Brandeis, we look at the economy as an equilibrium. We look at maximizing the welfare or maximizing the output, whatever. The Schumpeterian antitrust will look at the economy in disequilibrium. The idea is to not maximize so much allocative efficiency or productive efficiency of the firms, but it's to maximize the dynamic efficiency of the market. And dynamic efficiency of the market is to spur and accelerate one equilibrium to the other and to the other and to the other. So we have these gales of creative destructions that keeps forcing and undermining the monopoly rents of incumbents at the benefits of innovation rents. Innovators should benefit from rents, but those rents should be driven by innovation, shouldn't be driven by government regulations or government protections or monopolistic rents. And so this Schumpeterian antitrust is, of course, I would say almost the least popular with regulators. But yet, as we embark in not only this digital revolution anymore, but this AI revolution and quantum competition and quantum, I think we're seeing every day that those market forces discipline these incumbents, and innovation is the best way to compete. So we should perhaps rethink how we approach antitrust, and beyond this debate between antitrust as a decentralization tool or antitrust as an efficiency tool, which has been the tension between Brandeisian antitrust and Borkian antitrust, I think we should adopt a more innovation-driven approach to antitrust, where innovation will lead to more competition, which will lead to more equality of opportunities. So the Schumpeter antitrust, which has been dormant for the last 20th century, I think may have a role to play in the 21st century. It's not clear how, because of course it needs to be better taken into consideration, but there's no better way than today to take that into considerations. Why? For many reasons. First, because Brandeisian antitrust has been disqualified and been perhaps too radical. Second, very few people wants to go back to traditional Borkian antitrust and Chicago school. So we're in the middle where we don't know which school of thought to adopt. So I think there's a momentum now. And second is because of this fantastic technological revolution we live in. I think the innovations we see show that innovation and cash burn and the massive investment that those companies make is that the way they think, they don't think necessarily of product and prices, they think about investment and innovation. And that completely upset our way of thinking about stuff, about market shares. Just take a company like Nvidia, which is leading in the technological innovation when it comes to chips and others. I think they're facing a lot of competition, even though those quantitative metrics are not showing what traditional antitrust will first think. So I think there's a number of examples where we see that we need a more innovation first approach to antitrust, where dynamic competition, not static competition, but dynamic competition, with a look at potential entrants and incumbents and competitive forces and the reality of competitive constraints can have a role in the future of antitrust. So that's the main point that I try to articulate in the book, how history can inform the future of antitrust. And we've been in this paradigm shift that have been radical, and it's perhaps time to stabilize the pendulum and to get together into a less ideological debate where it's not two polarized extremes that don't speak to each other and sometimes hate each other, but an idea where innovation is king, and we should focus on innovation as a way to promote competition. And that itself is a shifting of the relationship. It's shifting the way we look at the relationship between competition and innovation, and that again has been exemplified by the recent Nobel Prize laureate where Schumpeterian approach to competition innovation were rewarded because we need to operationalize that, and we need to understand how firms compete. And most of the time, they don't compete on price and quantity; they compete on innovation. Unfortunately, our regulatory toolkits is not up for the tasks, and yet we need to think of that as we write the future of antitrust. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any question.
Great. Well, Fernanda, Ladies first.
Okay, thank you very much. A pleasure, Aurelien. Nice to meet you here, and thanks for your presentation. My question is, in this map of schools that you present, where do you see the current European approach where they are regulating the big techs in order to promote a kind of incremental innovation instead of your disruptive innovation? That's my
Thank you very much for this question. I think it's a very important question. I haven't mentioned it, but that's what I called. I have a whole chapter in the book. That's what I called precautionary antitrust. The European Union is very much driven by the precautionary principle. The idea that you want to regulate first, you want to have the permission in order to have before having this innovation. And the precautionary, even the European Council has written some reports how the precautionary principle may kill innovation, and we need an innovation principle. So even Europeans themselves are aware of the unintended consequence of precautionary principle. What I mean by a precautionary antitrust is the idea that we should have marginal, permissioned innovation, like things that do not disrupt too much the the status quo, what the stakeholders and whatever, and the innovation needs to be almost approved. And that is a very antithesis of innovation, because if there is something about innovation, is to be permissionless. You don't ask to innovate because that kills the purpose of innovation. There's no innovation if the regulators approve the innovation. Most innovations upset the status quo and comes against sometimes some regulations. It's at the age of regulation. Think of self-driving, autonomous car self-driving. Well, it's illegal in most countries to self-drive, but is it part of innovation? Yes, it is. So you need to do stuff that are on the edge of innovation, on the in the beta version, in order to innovate. And I think the Europeans have a look at fostering competition within the current innovation landscape, right? Like with the technical capabilities that we have, we want more competition. Just to take the car industry again, we want more competition against the car manufacturers of Europe. That's great. We want, how do we make that Volkswagen can compete more in Spain, and some French company can compete more in other countries. So they want more competition amongst the current manufacturers. And most of the time, why? Well, because they have state aid and they have some stakes in those very manufacturers. So they wanted to help them. And that is the opposite of innovation. When the regulators, when they have a stake in the current incumbents, of course they're going to do whatever they can to help those incumbents, right? It's like, it's normal. And that is not innovation. Innovation, radical innovation, is to fundamentally disrupt those innovators, these incumbents, sorry. Like, where is the European Tesla? Well, we don't have, because the Renault, the Volkswagen are helped, subsidized by their respective governments. So the idea is, we like in Europe, they like marginal innovation, and of course, with a very, I would say, Luddite approach to innovations, with a strong skepticism toward technological improvements, where there's a fear of violating some laws and regulations, and a fear of harming people. But guess what? There cannot be innovation without harm. And that's the sad truth, but it's the inconvenient truth. You harm. Each time you innovate, you harm, right? You create a digital business, you'll harm physical stores. That's inevitable. You create a fantastic EV car manufacturers, you'll harm the current old mechanical workers in the current manufacturers. And I think Europe has been so used to a social welfare, and this idea of nobody should harm anybody, that we cannot accept the side effect of innovation, which is to come, as again, as Schumpeter said, with just a war. It's like a bombardment. It's just completely disrupt lives. It put businesses in bankruptcy, in insolvency, and that Europe cannot accept. So I think in Europe, we're focused on preserving the status quo rather than generating the harms from innovations. And that's fine. But we have to acknowledge this trade-off. And unfortunately, not only Europe does this, but they're unaware of this trade-off. They say that no, we promote innovation and we want to harm nobody. But they need to understand this trade-off. If we want to harm nobody, that's fine. But this comes with innovation cost. That's it. We have to acknowledge it. If we want maximum innovation, we have to acknowledge that there will be some side effect. And unfortunately, we can talk about the Digital Market Act and ex ante type of regulation. This precautionary, like we want all the benefits of those tech platforms, the innovations, while regulating them ex ante in order to have permissioned innovations. But that's exactly why you won't have innovation, right? And so there's a tension that is not adopted, and I can explain that from this social welfare approach where harm from innovation has become unacceptable in Europe. That's what I call precautionary antitrust, and that has been propelled all over the world with the Brussels effect. Thank you.
Ricardo. Ricardo,
Esteban no estaba delante mío, no sé.
but Esteban was before you, but he
Okay,
changed his mind. Apparently,
okay. No problem, no
My
problem.
question was made by Fernanda.
Okay, Aurelien, thank you very much for your speech and for presenting the general ideas of your book. I didn't have the opportunity to read it yet, but I will try to get it and read it as soon as I can. One question that I don't know if it is part of your study and your book, but something that is also making me think about the big techs and the regulations and the antitrust enforcement on them. Some theories are analyzing some big techs and some markets where the big techs are active as markets characterized as the winner gets it all, which means that someone will start and some will compete, and after some competition, one of them will prevail, and this will be the big tech. Like you have, I don't know, here in Brazil is very popular, the WhatsApp. You may have the, I don't know, the Instagram, TikTok, and so on and so forth. I would agree that trying to regulate ex ante the big techs may affect the capability of them to be innovative and to innovate and to bring innovations that will be expected by the market and by the consumers that will offer better experiences for us. However, assuming that there is no pre-regulation, thinking about antitrust enforcement, this process of the winners get it all may produce some abusive practices by those that are trying to get this position, the winner position,
Yeah.
and or after getting a comfortable, I do not say comfortable because the innovative market is always uncomfortable for all of them, but after getting a better position in the market, maybe these bigger companies will adopt abusive practices in order to keep the movement of being the winner or keeping the position of winner. How would the antitrust or would you understand that the antitrust enforcement is prepared to face these abusive practices in the middle of all this complexity of
Yeah.
dealing with big techs?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for your question. I think it's an important question, and I want to make sure that yes, large tech companies do abuse their market positions and are engaging in anti-competitive conduct. It doesn't mean that because they've innovated or they keep innovating that they have a carte blanche and they can really have a free pass. That's not the case. They do violate antitrust laws and other sometimes consumer protection laws, and they should be punished for that. It should be. My point is to say, first, there needs to be an innovation approach. So innovation approach, I mean, the best way to protect innovation, as we all know, is with patent, right? So uh, when you have a patent, most of the time you have years of protections of these innovations, right? It doesn't mean that you cannot violate your patent. You can abuse your patent. You can have anti-competitive behaviors while enjoying your patent. Well, now talk about digital market where let's assume a specific product or service is not patented, but it's the same logics of recoupment, right? You burn a lot of cash and it takes 10 years to recoup or whatever. It's very similar to a patent, but in an unpatented technology. Yes, we need to be conscious of this innovation and that they can recoup this innovation with enjoying temporary kind of large positions. But that doesn't mean that they can abuse this position during this temporary monopoly power. I think I will take an innovation approach that is similar to patents, but in unpatented product and services. So like there's a 10 years, there's a 15 years period where, yes, we can understand from a business perspective, there's been some investment that needs to be recouped for the next 10, 15 years. That creates some great positions if the product and services is successful. But that doesn't mean it should be a carte blanche. So, for example, to be very specific, those tech companies, yes, they may be large companies, and a lot of business users want to interpret with those companies, like through interoperability requirements. And guess what? I'm going to say it unequivocally. Yes, a lot of refusal of interoperability requests are abusive. A lot of business users request those large tech companies to interoperate with those large tech companies, and those requests are rejected, not because of innovation or because of some whatever risks. It's because those business users directly compete with the product and services on those gatekeepers they rely on. And that is wrong. And that is unacceptable. And that should be punished. Equally, another example, those large tech companies acquire startups, right? Like most of them, it's totally fine. You have the finance and the investment in those startups because you have the hope of an exit, right? If the big tech companies stop buying those startups, the startups will see their investment drying out. But so the killer acquisitions narrative saying like, oh, all these acquisitions are for killers, so like they acquire this company to shut down this product and services. That's not true. What we see is most of the time they acquire those companies to do the product even better and make it more accessible. But at the same time, is it true that sometimes some big tech company acquire competitors and just because they're afraid and they're scared of those potential entrants? Yes, of course. So I think we need to look at without prejudgment, without bias, and saying like, yes, tech companies can look at the next potential entrants and try to acquire them, not to shut down the product, but to accelerate the product. But would that company been better off outside this large tech company? Well, perhaps yes. One example is Adobe Figma, right? Adobe wanted to buy Figma because they saw that as a big competitor. Well, it was being refused, it was being rejected by the regulator, and Figma is just still growing and doing very well outside. So you could see that here, this merger refusal was pretty on point because it was a company that wanted to acquire a potential competitor to make the innovation in-house, and this competitor can grow outside the company without any. So I think it's good to look at, yes, they need innovation rents, as I said. They need years, just like a patent, right? You need years to recoup the innovations. But at the same time, it doesn't prevent from a case-by-case analysis using qualitative metrics, not quantitative metrics, but qualitative metrics, and looking at the reality of each behavior, whether this can be justified for a innovation purpose, like would this justify for innovation, or is just justified to shut down a competitor or to abuse a dominant position against a competitor? Well, if it's the latter, they should unequivocally be sanctioned. That's not an issue. But looking at innovation first will change the paradigm by which we analyze those behavior.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Aurelien. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, I have a question. You mentioned Europe, but most countries around the world have adopted their antitrust laws following during the golden age of Bork antitrust. Now moving between or playing between your book and your role at the lab, do you see that the debate that is taking place in the United States, since, as you mentioned, since the Trump 1.0 era, has been reflected in other jurisdictions as well?
I think so, yes. I think internationally, surprisingly, Europe has an extremely strong soft power effect, the Brussels effect, where we call it. So I think a lot of countries still look at Europe even more than the US, because perhaps the US is too politicized, right? Like Democrats, Republicans, like in the FTC, it's a very politicized institutions. It's all politics. Whereas Europe has this less pretense of technocracy, right? Like it's not politics, it's technocracy, and I think a lot of like developing countries and look at Europe as a wrongly sometimes as a neutral, objective way of doing competition that has been very inspirational and very very illustrative of what they should be doing. Whereas the US, it seems to me that it's very tied up to the US political system, right? The populism of the 19th century, the FTC Act and the Borkian school and the justice system is completely different in the US as opposed to a lot of countries where judges are elected or there's elections for judges as opposed to just appointments. So I think a lot of countries in the developing world will still look at Europe more, added the DMA effect, that the Brussels effect, where Europe has portrayed itself as the regulator, the one big thought leader when it comes to regulation of digital markets and competition. And during the time of Brandeis and others, the new Brandeisians, there's been a completely the completely undermining of the international efforts of the FTC and DOJ. I can tell you that the international sections of the FTC and the DOJ has completely been shattered. So there was no willingness of the US antitrust authorities to promote their words, their visions to the world. Well, also first because they didn't care, they wanted domestic effect, and second because it was highly politicized. It was like everything we've done has been wrong. We have to completely change. And you speak to countries which have been following the US example. So even that message of saying like what we've been telling you for 40 years was all wrong, you shouldn't listen to us anymore, even that is not audible, right? It's not intelligible. So that's why they also retracted themselves, because they didn't have a good narrative to sell. Whereas Europeans At the same time, during the DMA, the 2020 to now 2025, they had this beautiful narrative that was very sellable about, hey, we have these huge tech companies, you don't know what to do with it. Well, guess what? We have this beautiful piece of European regulations that is called the Digital Market Act, and you should perhaps follow it. And so they had this narrative that was coherent. And also, it was not left and right. Both left-wing politicians in Europe, right-wing politicians in Europe were saying the same thing in unanimity, right? Whereas in the US, you didn't have a US voice. Everything what Lineker was saying was being destroyed by FTC Republican commissioners and opposite. So I think Europe comes in a much less politicized, much more unified, much better narrative to the developing world that is much more sellable.
Thanks. Esteban.
Yes, thank you, Aurelien. To complement the question, maybe one branch of populism is related with nationalism and protectionism. And how do you think these geopolitical tensions and the rise of industrial policy protecting national champions and all these kind of maybe trade restrictions also do you think it will influence and shape the future of antitrust in the US and maybe in the world?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I was in March at Geneva at the World Trade Organizations, where my lab organized precisely a conference on this topic of trade and competition at the World Trade Organization. And it was very telling to me because I had some hopes that there's a working group of trade and competition that has been shut down for the last 20 years, and the World Trade Organization has no role whatsoever when it comes to competition and antitrust. For the last 20 years, it was the request of China. When China had joined, they wanted something that the World Trade Organization doesn't work anymore on antitrust and competition. And we have this hope, perhaps antitrust scholars and all that, to reactivate that or to do for the World Trade Organization to have a say when it comes to competition, market entry, unfair competition. And unfortunately, this is not going to happen. I'm telling you that we live in an extremely strong world of populism, protectionism, and nationalism, as you just said. So how do I reconcile this? Well, it's easy. It's part of populism. When I explain, the thing that the headquarters are relocated in the coastal cities, like you live in Kansas and your employer is and it's relocated to Seattle. Well, it's the same thing with globalization. It's not relocated to New York or Seattle. It's relocated to China or India. And this idea of losing control over your own territory, this has been extremely powerful. Like no matter what the benefits of globalizations are and innovation and digitalizations, people have felt that they lost control over their own territory. Their industrial base has been disseminated, right? Everything is being produced by China and India. Nothing is being produced where they used to be produced. And all this, the narrative goes, all this is because of unfair competition by China and India. So they compete unfairly, so we cannot compete. So the competition, we have to reinstore competition in our domestic borders and that requires market barriers. And what are the greatest market barriers ever that a country can erect? Tariff and non-tariff barriers. And so the populism of like losing control over your own destiny because of innovation, where there's massive disruptions inside the country, right, to the urban centers, or outside the countries to to China and India, that has driven populism. The populism, when people are in Kansas or whatever in Midwest, they are upset with New York. They are also upset with China. They're upset by the loss of control over their own local economy. And it's the same thing, right? You can be in the countryside of Argentina. You're upset against these large headquarters, large corporations that are in Buenos Aires. But also you're upset by the fact that there may be product coming from China and India. And so the answer to that is fostering competition domestically by erecting barriers externally and by breaking up monopolies internally. And those two goes together because the competition that is exerted internationally is seen as unfair competition, and the competition that is exerted domestically is seen as unfair competition because of these large companies that make those small businesses unable to compete with. So it's just the idea of unfairness. And that's why we come back to this idea of fair competition and others. Like scale is seen increasingly as a route for unfair competition, being domestic firms like large tech companies or international firms. And I think that's why this populism is not conducive to any line of thought, because we start these trade wars, right? You erect barriers, but guess what? China is going to erect barriers as well. And we see that the last few days and weeks about rare earth materials, where they control all the chips and technological industry. So it's just a race to the bottom where everybody's erecting barriers. Competition is being diminished, globalization is being diminished, and everybody's worse off. But that's because of the populist string, where we want to tackle these large companies, being domestic or foreign, that have disrupted the status quo. So the answer is more innovation. It doesn't mean that all the competition from China or India or other countries is fair. Yes, there might be some case of unfair competition. That's why I'm saying that the WTO should have a say. The WTO should have a say to make sure that this competition is fair. Unfortunately, they refrain from truly acting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Aurelien, we have time for traditional, which is the guest speaker gives the concluding remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for listening to me, and I hope this book will be of interest so that you can read it. But thank you for all these questions. I think they were very interesting. I think we live in a fantastic time, intellectually, conceptually. That's why we are at the crossroad of different school of thoughts. But obviously, technologically, we embark in this incredible tech revolution, and that forces us to rethink how we look at innovation, because we're talking about technology. And inevitably, this innovation landscape is the competitive landscape. So that's the main point I wanted to make, is perhaps it's not fostering competition to increase innovation, is understanding the innovation landscape is the key for regulating competition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I'll see you everyone. I hope to see everyone next month. On December 11th, we have Ori Schwartz, who is the head of division of competition at the OECD, presenting the OECD is launching a report on recent trends in competition in the past 10 years. So he will be speaking about that. I hope to see you then. Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.
I thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.